The silence in the mines. A single decision in Washington has just silenced engines that roared for generations. One tariff, pitched as protection, has turned into a weapon cutting into America's own backbone. Copper, coal, rare earths, the minerals that fuel power grids, defense systems, and the next wave of technology. Mines that once powered entire towns are shutting down, leaving families wondering what happened to the promises made in their name. But here's the real twist. While America stumbles, Canada is stepping in. Deals are being signed, shipments are already rerouted, and the consequences, they go far beyond jobs or local economies. This is about who controls the future of energy, defense, and global influence. So the question is simple. Has Washington just handed Canada the keys to the mineral kingdom? Stay with me, because what you'll hear in the next few minutes might change the way you look at the global economy. From boomtowns to ghost towns, the silence came first. Mining towns in Arizona, West Virginia, and Nevada that once shook with the roar of drills now echo with nothing but wind across empty yards. In Arizona, copper pits, some of the largest in North America, have pulled their workers. Families who depended on steady paychecks for generations are left staring at locked gates. Across West Virginia, coal yards that once filled rail cars daily now stand eerily still. Locomotives idling with no cargo to carry. This isn't just about lost jobs, it's about the collapse of a rhythm that defined entire communities. Dinners that depended on overtime pay, local stores that thrived on miners' wages, schools that counted on tax revenue from industrial property. With every mine closure, the shockwaves ripple outward. And yet, the bigger story isn't even inside these towns. It's in the boardrooms and international markets where decisions made in seconds shift the fate of millions. The gamble in Washington. Root of this unraveling traces back to a gamble: tariffs on imported minerals. Policymakers framed it as protection, a chance to revive domestic mining, a bold step to keep America independent. But instead of revival, the move triggered something far more dangerous. Long-standing supply lines, especially with Canada, were severed. Contracts worth billions in raw materials vanished overnight, and Canada didn't wait. Within weeks, exports were redirected to Europe and Asia. Buyers in Tokyo, Seoul, and Brussels snapped up deals, eager to lock in supply chains that could stretch for decades. While Washington promised revival, America's production was already slowing. Mines cut shifts, smelters delayed upgrades, contractors canceled orders, and confidence, that invisible lifeline of every market, began to erode. Communities on the edge, the consequences reach well beyond the mine gates. In Michigan, auto plants are warning of copper shortages that threaten assembly lines. In Ohio, turbine manufacturers report delays in securing the alloys they need. Renewable projects in California and Texas are pausing construction, waiting for wiring and metals that aren't arriving on time. Even the Pentagon is sounding alarms. Rare earth elements, the hidden backbone of radar systems, missile guidance, and stealth coatings, are suddenly harder to secure. For a defense industry that prides itself on readiness, dependence on uncertain supply is not just an inconvenience, it's a vulnerability. And while American officials debate policy in Washington, Canadian leaders are moving with speed and precision. Mines in Ontario and Quebec are accelerating exports. Smelters in British Columbia are running longer shifts. Ports in Vancouver and Prince Rupert are expanding capacity to push more minerals across the Pacific. Canada's quiet advantage here is what makes this shift even more remarkable. It's not accidental. For years, Canada invested in infrastructure and trade agreements while the United States debated. Agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement gave Canadian exports tariff-free pathways into global markets. So when Washington imposed tariffs, Canada was ready to reroute, ready to expand, ready to claim a bigger share of the market. And the buyers noticed. Reliability matters as much as price. Manufacturers in Europe and Asia now see Canada as the partner that delivers without the political noise. Those contracts are being signed now, not for months, but for decades. Which raises the question, is this a temporary stumble for the United States, or the start of a permanent power shift in the global mineral market? The human cost. While that question looms over boardrooms and parliaments, the human cost is immediate. In Arizona, families are struggling to cover mortgages as mining paychecks disappear. In West Virginia, truckers who hauled coal for years now line up for unemployment assistance. In Nevada, young workers wonder if they need to leave home altogether just to find work. Local diners see fewer customers. Hardware stores cut hours. Banks tighten credit, afraid of defaults. Schools brace for staff cuts as industrial tax revenue dries up. It's the slow bleed of a way of life, one closure at a time. And recovery. It's never simple. Equipment that sits idle deteriorates. Skilled miners move on to new opportunities, often never returning. Contracts with buyers collapse, and rebuilding trust can take years. Industry leaders warn, once production halts, the path back is always longer and more expensive than policymakers imagine. A growing political crisis. All of this is feeding into a storm on Capitol Hill. Governors from hard-hit states are pressing Washington for relief, calling for temporary tariff suspensions or emergency subsidies. Members of Congress, from both parties, warn that the U.S. is ceding ground to foreign suppliers at the worst possible moment. But politics is its own trap. No one wants to appear soft on trade, even as the economic costs climb. Leaders know the optics of retreat are dangerous. That leaves Washington stuck between defending a political stance and facing the reality of industrial decline. Meanwhile, across the border, Canada is not waiting for America to figure it out. It is locking in long-term deals, expanding production, and positioning itself as the go-to supplier for the critical minerals that power the modern world. Canada's quiet power grab while Washington wrestles with politics. Ottawa is moving with remarkable clarity. Because in every crisis lies an opportunity, and Canada, often seen as the quiet neighbor, is seizing this one with both hands. The blueprint already in place. This didn't happen overnight. Canada's strategy for minerals wasn't a sudden reaction to Washington's tariffs. It was the result of years of groundwork for over a decade. Canadian policymakers studied one central fact: the future economy runs on minerals. Copper for electric grids, lithium for batteries, nickel for electric vehicles, rare earths for defense systems and high-tech manufacturing. And unlike the United States, Canada acted before the crunch arrived. Billions were poured into mapping reserves, upgrading mining technology, and most importantly, building trade agreements that could give its exports priority access around the globe. So when Washington imposed tariffs, Canada didn't scramble. It executed a playbook already written, was simply put into motion. Infrastructure as a weapon. Take the Port of Vancouver. For years, it was seen as a key link for Canadian exports. But in the past 5 years, Ottawa quietly funded massive expansions. Rail lines were modernized. Terminals were deepened to handle larger ships. Logistics hubs were automated to reduce wait times. The result, when American miners began cutting output, Canadian ports were already positioned to ship larger volumes. Abroad, containers once carrying lumber and grain now load with copper, nickel, and rare earths destined for Asia. The port of Prince Rupert, smaller but closer to Asian markets, received similar upgrades. Shipping times to Tokyo or Seoul from Prince Rupert are nearly a day shorter than from Los Angeles or Seattle. In global trade, those hours mean money, reliability, and trust. Infrastructure became more than transport. It became a competitive edge, one that manufacturers in Europe and Asia are now betting on. The trade web. But Canada's most important tool wasn't physical. It was diplomatic. When the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017, Canada stayed in and became a central player in what is now the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership (CPT). That deal gave Canadian exports tariff-free or reduced tariff access to markets stretching from Japan to Australia. Layer on top of that CETA, Canada's trade pact with the European Union. Suddenly, Canadian minerals could move into Europe without the barriers facing American producers. And the final piece, USMCA, the updated NAFTA deal. Ironically, while Washington raised tariffs, USMCA still gave Canadian products preferential access to the American market. That meant Canada could export freely into the U.S., while American miners found their exports facing walls abroad. The message was clear. Canada had built a web of agreements that turned its mineral resources into a global currency. Global buyers. Take notice in Tokyo, government officials fast-tracked meetings with Canadian trade representatives. Japan, heavily dependent on imports for critical minerals, wanted long-term stability. Contracts for nickel and lithium were signed, not for 2 years, but for 20. In Brussels, European leaders made similar moves. For years, the EU sought to reduce reliance on Russian energy and Chinese rare earths. Canadian suppliers were suddenly the answer. By mid-year, reports surfaced of multi-billion-dollar contracts inked with Canadian mining firms. In Seoul, South Korea's battery giants saw opportunity. With electric vehicle demand soaring, securing nickel and cobalt was a matter of corporate survival. Canada became the partner of choice, offering not just minerals but the stability of a democratic, resource-rich state. This wasn't just business, it was geopolitics disguised as trade. Every new deal signed with Ottawa shifted global dependence away from Beijing, Moscow, and even Washington. America on the sidelines. Meanwhile, in the United States, the story was unraveling differently. Supply chains grew tighter. Manufacturers delayed projects. Lobbyists pressed lawmakers for relief. Governors pleaded for exemptions. But the machinery of Washington moved slowly, and as America debated, Canada delivered. Each day of delay meant more contracts signed abroad. Every canceled American shipment was an opportunity for Ottawa to fill the gap. One striking example came in the renewable energy sector. A major European wind turbine manufacturer, once reliant on American copper, shifted entirely to Canadian supply within months. The company cited predictability of export pathways, a polite way of saying Washington had become unreliable. This wasn't just lost business, it was lost trust. And in global trade, trust is everything. A new reputation for decades. Canada was typecast as America's quiet partner. Reliable, yes, but rarely dominant. This moment is rewriting that story. Suddenly, Canada isn't just a supplier, it's a hub, a country seen as dependable, adaptable, and prepared. From mining investors in London to auto executives in Munich, the message is spreading. Canada is where you secure your future supply. And reputation, once built, is hard to erase. Even if Washington backtracks on tariffs tomorrow, global buyers now see Canada as the safer bet. The contracts signed today could define supply chains for decades. Long after the immediate crisis fades, the ripple effect, the effects don't stop. At minerals, with trade ties deepening, Canada's role in global politics is expanding. Its voice in G7 meetings grows stronger. Its leverage in NATO discussions increases, especially when critical resources are on the table. For Ottawa, this is not just about economics. It's about carving out a place as a middle power with disproportionate influence, a broker between Europe, Asia, and even America. And it all started because Washington miscalculated. A policy meant to protect domestic industry instead accelerated Canada's rise. The unanswered question, but here's the twist. Not everything is secure. Canada may be winning contracts, but with victory comes exposure. Ramping up production means higher environmental costs, local resistance, and questions about whether the country can sustain the pace. And for Washington, the question lingers. Is it too late to reclaim its role, or is there still a window to act? Because the longer the silence in American minds continues, the louder Canada's engines roar. When trade becomes power, a trade dispute rarely stays about trade. Because once resources become scarce, they stop being commodities and start being leverage. That's the point Washington is waking up to too late. While U.S. factories stall, Canada is quietly turning minerals into political capital, and the ripple effects are stretching far beyond economics. The Pentagon's sudden wake-up call inside the Pentagon. The alarms went off earlier than most admit. Rare earth elements, a group of 17 minerals critical for defense systems, were already a known vulnerability. They power fighter jets, guided missiles, radar, even night vision goggles. For years, over 80% of global supply came from China. Washington had plans to diversify, but the tariffs scrambled everything. American miners scaled back. Imports slowed. Stockpiles shrank. And then, reports landed on Pentagon desks. Canada was securing deals with Japan, Korea, and Europe for many of the same minerals the U.S. defense industry needed. It wasn't just about losing contracts, it was about losing control. For the first time, America risked becoming dependent on its northern neighbor for critical defense supply. A shift in dependence flips the power dynamic. For decades, the U.S. held the upper hand, setting terms, dictating policy, expecting compliance. But with minerals, the balance tilts. If Canadian companies are locking in long-term deals with allies, Washington can't simply snap its fingers and get priority. Suddenly, the Pentagon is the one knocking on Ottawa's door. It's a subtle but profound shift, and every policymaker knows. Once leverage is lost, it's rarely regained quickly. Europe's calculated move. The European Union saw this shift early and acted decisively, long wary of relying on Washington for security while relying on Beijing for resources. Brussels saw Canada as the bridge it needed. Officials framed it in technical terms: supply chain resilience, strategic diversification. But behind the jargon was a clear motive: reduce vulnerability to both superpowers. In practice, that meant pouring billions into Canadian mining projects, offering subsidies for European firms that partnered with Ottawa, and even hinting at joint defense industrial ventures tied directly to resource access. For Europe, Canada wasn't just a supplier, it was a ticket to independence. Asia's bet. Meanwhile, in Asia, the game turned into a bidding war. Japan, with its memory of supply shocks from China in 2010, treated Canadian contracts like national security insurance. South Korea's conglomerates went further, co-financing mines in Quebec and Ontario to guarantee access for decades. And then came whispers from India. As New Delhi positions itself as a counterweight to Beijing, it too has shown interest in Canadian partnerships. Imagine that. Canada, not just feeding traditional allies, but also shaping the resource base of the world's fastest-growing democracy. Each new deal left Washington more isolated. Ottawa's dilemma. At first glance, this was Canada's dream scenario. More contracts, more influence, more leverage. But with every advantage came a new dilemma. Should Canada prioritize exports to allies like Japan and Europe, or keep stockpiles available for American defense needs? Should Ottawa lean into its new role as a global broker, or quietly reassure Washington that the traditional alliance still held priority? Behind closed doors, Canadian officials debated fiercely. Publicly, they spoke of balancing commitments. Privately, they knew this moment was more than economics. It was about identity. Was Canada still America's junior partner, or was it ready to step into a bigger role on the world stage? Washington's counterplay, meanwhile, U.S. policymakers weren't blind. They saw what was happening and began scrambling for a counter-strategy. Pushed for fast-tracking domestic mining permits, others floated subsidies to lure investors back to American projects. A few even whispered about national security exceptions, effectively overriding tariffs to keep defense supply chains alive. But none of it could happen overnight. Mining projects take years, sometimes decades, to move from exploration to production, and every delay worked in Canada's favor. Washington also tried diplomacy. Envoys quietly approached Ottawa, asking for assurances that American defense would not be left exposed. But assurances are not contracts. And by then, Canadian miners were already tied to Europe and Asia. The Pentagon, for the first time in living memory, faced the possibility of competing with allies for access to resources. The symbolism of power geopolitics thrives on symbols, and this moment produced one that spread quickly among diplomats and analysts. For decades, America protected Canada's security. Now Canada was protecting America's supply. That reversal, quiet but unmistakable, sent ripples across the international order. If Washington could lose leverage over its closest neighbor, what did that say about its broader position in the world? Russia and China watched closely, of course. Rivals were watching. In Moscow, analysts noted how quickly Europe turned to Canada. For Russia, long reliant on energy exports to maintain influence, the shift was unsettling. If Europe could rewire its resource map this quickly, Moscow's leverage might shrink faster than expected. In Beijing, the calculation was different. China remained the global giant in rare earths, but Canada's rise was inconvenient. It offered us allies a safe alternative and undermined Beijing's ability to use resources as a political weapon. Both Russia and China understood Canada wasn't just filling a gap, it was rewriting the resource playbook, a new kind of alliance test. Which brings us to the core tension, the U.S.-Canada alliance itself. On paper, it's one of the closest partnerships in the world. Defense, trade, intelligence sharing, the ties run deep. But alliances are tested not in treaties, but in crises. And now the test is whether resource leverage can coexist with traditional trust. Would Canada ever prioritize Tokyo or Brussels over Washington? Could America accept even the perception of being second in line? Diplomats tried to downplay it, but military planners, corporate executives, and financial markets saw the truth. The alliance was shifting, subtly but surely. Growing question. So, we return to the question that haunted Washington policymakers. Was this a temporary setback, a blip caused by tariffs, or the start of a new reality where America's dominance in critical supply chains could no longer be assumed? Because if Canada could do it with minerals, what stopped others from doing it in other industries? The trade war had spilled into geopolitics, and the consequences were only beginning to surface. Fractures beneath the surface. Every empire, every rising power, faces the same paradox. The world sees strength, but at home, cracks quietly spread. Canada is no different. While contracts pour in from Europe and Asia, and Washington scrambles to recalibrate, a quieter storm brews inside Canada's borders, one that could make or break its new role. The land beneath the boom. It all begins with the land. Canada's mineral wealth doesn't sit in boardrooms or trade halls. It lies buried in forests, mountains, and territories where indigenous communities have lived for centuries. Every new mine, every proposed expansion, every transport corridor slices into land tied to cultural identity, legal treaties, and environmental sanctity. Politicians talk about strategic resources, but on the ground, it feels more like intrusion, or worse, betrayal. Some indigenous councils have signed agreements, seeing opportunity in jobs, revenue, and sovereignty through negotiation. Others reject the projects outright, warning that, once the land is gone, no amount of money can bring it back. This divide creates friction, not just with corporations, but within indigenous communities themselves. And Ottawa finds itself walking a tightrope between honoring commitments and fueling resentment. The green dilemma. Then comes the climate paradox. To the outside world, Canada's pivot to minerals looks like part of the clean energy revolution. Critical minerals are essential for electric vehicles, batteries, wind turbines, and solar panels. They are supposed to fuel the future, not destroy it, but extraction is messy. Mining scars landscapes. It consumes water. It creates waste. For communities near the projects, green transition looks anything but green. Environmental groups seize on this contradiction. They argue Canada risks trading one kind of dependency on foreign oil and minerals for another, an endless cycle of exploitation under the banner of sustainability. Protests erupt outside government buildings. Court battles multiply. International watchdogs begin asking uncomfortable questions. Can Canada claim moral high ground on climate if its boom comes at such environmental cost. Political fault lines, and then there's politics. In Ottawa, the mineral surge becomes a partisan battlefield. The government frames it as a national triumph, proof of resilience after the tariff shock, proof that Canada can lead in a new era. But opposition parties smell blood. They hammer the government on environmental hypocrisy, on the slow pace of revenue sharing with Indigenous nations, on fears of selling out to Europe or Asia instead of prioritizing Canadians. In some regions, mining jobs bring political gratitude. In others, fear of ecological damage sparks backlash. Provincial leaders clash with federal policy, and the narrative of unity so powerful on the world stage begins to fracture at home. The social divide beneath the policy fights lies something deeper, a cultural divide. Urban Canadians, far from the mines, often cheer the new role Canada is playing on the global stage. They see headlines about influence and contracts. They see opportunities in tech, finance, and diplomacy. But in rural and Indigenous communities, the costs are lived daily. Roads cut through hunting grounds. Rivers face contamination risks, and promises of consultation often feel hollow. This divide fuels mistrust, and mistrust is political dynamite. Because when people no longer believe the system respects them, they look for alternatives or for leaders who promise to tear the system down. Ottawa's balancing act inside government halls. The tension is palpable. Every minister knows the stakes. If Ottawa pushes too hard, it risks igniting social unrest and environmental backlash. But if it slows down, Canada could lose its hard-won global momentum. Diplomats abroad want reassurance that contracts will be honored. Investors demand certainty. Defense planners in Washington and Brussels plead for timelines. But none of that erases the protests, the court filings, the community meetings where anger simmers. It's a balancing act with no easy solution. Markets. Notice the cracksand markets, of course, are watching. At first, investors poured money into Canadian mining, treating it as a safe bet. But as legal battles mount and projects face delays, doubts creep in. Can Canada really deliver at the scale it promises? Or will politics and protests drag everything down? Stock prices wobble, analysts hedge. Risk assessments, once glowing, start to include new caveats. And just like that, the perception of unstoppable momentum begins to flicker. The pressure from Ellie's complicating everything. Canada's allies don't want excuses. Brussels wants deliveries on time. Tokyo wants guaranteed supply. Washington, already frustrated, cannot accept delays that compromise defense contracts. Diplomats grow blunt. Behind closed doors, they remind Ottawa that global credibility isn't just built by striking deals. It's built by keeping them. This external pressure collides with domestic resistance. And the more Ottawa tries to satisfy both, the harder the contradictions become to manage. A brewing crisis of trust at the core. It becomes a question of trust. Do Canadians trust their leaders to balance prosperity with protection? Do Indigenous nations trust Ottawa to honor its commitments? Do allies trust Canada to rise above domestic friction and act as a reliable supplier? Each layer of trust is fragile. Each misstep risks unraveling the delicate fabric of Canada's new role. And in politics, perception is reality. If enough people believe the boom is unsustainable, at home or abroad, momentum can collapse overnight. The shadow of history. What makes it worse is history. Canada has been here before. Resource booms that promised transformation, only to end in busts, scandals, or resentment. From oil sands to forestry, the pattern is familiar. Wealth concentrated in some hands, costs borne by others, and promises of balance often broken. This time, leaders insist, is different. This time, it's not just about profit, it's about global strategy. But history doesn't fade easily. Skepticism runs deep, and skeptics rarely stay quiet. A nation at a crossroads, and so Canada finds itself at a crossroads. One path leads to consolidation, finding a way to balance domestic fractures with international ambition, securing a sustainable role in the new order. The other path leads to fracture, protests escalating, projects stalling, allies losing patience, momentum slipping away. Which path Canada takes depends not just on policy, but on politics, perception, and trust. The reckoning. A single tariff, that's all it took to set this chain reaction in motion. When China slammed Canada's canola exports with a crippling 75.8% tariff, it looked like a death sentence. Billions in trade lost overnight. Farmers panicked. Analysts predicted collapse. But instead of breaking, Canada pivoted. It found new partners, expanded into critical minerals, and turned itself into a surprising player in the global economy. The rise was real, but now comes the harder part. Survival. Pressure. Without end on the surface, Canada stands tall. European contracts flow. Asian partnerships deepen. U.S. allies reluctantly recalibrate. The world now treats Canada as a supplier of choice for resources that define the next century. But momentum is a double-edged sword. With every new deal comes pressure to deliver. Every delay becomes a test of credibility. Every protest at home risks echoing abroad. The country that once looked like a victim of China's trade war now faces a question that may be even harder. Is it ready to lead? Ottawa's Highwire Act. Inside Ottawa, the atmosphere feels less like victory and more like triage. Cabinet meetings stretch late into the night. Ministers juggle demands that never align. Defense planners want resources prioritized for allies. Finance officials demand faster revenue flow. Indigenous leaders insist on rights and environmental safeguards. Environmental watchdogs warn of hypocrisy, and foreign diplomats keep asking, when can you guarantee delivery? It's a balancing act that feels like walking a tightrope in a storm, with the world watching. Washington's final card, and then comes the United States, no matter how far Canada stretches into Europe or Asia. Geography does not change. Washington remains the giant next door, and giants rarely tolerate neighbors who grow to independent. Whispers circulate in D.C. of new tariffs, disguised as security measures. Lobbyists push for subsidies that undercut Canadian minerals. Some even hint at revisiting NAFTA clauses, a reminder that America's economic muscle remains unmatched. The message is clear. Canada may rise, but not at America's expense. The irony is sharp. The very ally Canada relies on most now becomes its biggest obstacle. The global stakes. Canada's role is no longer just national, it's global. Brussels needs Canadian minerals to keep its green agenda alive. Tokyo sees Canada as a hedge against Chinese dominance. Washington, even while resisting, knows that without Canada, supply chains become dangerously exposed. The result? Every move Ottawa makes ripples far beyond its borders. A delay in one mine can stall European battery plants. A protest in one province can spark a boardroom panic in Tokyo. Canada's domestic battles are no longer private. They are international theater. The public turns at home. The public mood begins to shift. The early years of the boom brought optimism, but as environmental costs grow visible and promises to indigenous nations remain slow to materialize, skepticism rises. News outlets run exposés on polluted rivers near mining sites. Opposition leaders amplify stories of broken promises. Farmers, once the face of resilience, begin to ask whether the sacrifices they made were truly worth it. The same narrative that lifted Canada up, resilience, adaptability, strength, now risks being turned inside out. The crack that could break every great turning point comes down to a moment. For Canada, it could be one major protest that halts a key project, or a trade partner pulling out of a billion-dollar contract, or Washington finally deciding to punish its northern neighbor. None of these outcomes are guaranteed, but the fragility is undeniable. Canada has built its new power quickly, and quickly built power is always vulnerable. Momentum cuts both ways. The choice ahead, and so, the question hangs. Will Canada consolidate its rise, becoming a stable, trusted, global power? Or will the contradictions, environmental battles, political fractures, U.S. pressure, drag it back into the shadows of larger nations? The answer may depend less on resources themselves, and more on leadership, trust, and patience. If Ottawa can balance the scales, honoring Indigenous rights, enforcing environmental safeguards, and still delivering on global contracts, Canada could prove that small nations can play big roles without losing their soul. But if it fails, the rise could end as quickly as it began. Another boom in the history books. Another chance lost. The lesson of the tariff. Perhaps that's the final irony. What started as a punishment, a tariff meant to cripple Canada, became the spark of its transformation. It proved that strength is not measured by avoiding crisis, but by how a nation responds to one. Canada responded with resilience, strategy, and ambition. But now, resilience must evolve into sustainability. Because in geopolitics, survival is the real test of power. Closing reflection, a single tariff reshaped Canada's destiny. But the real story is not about tariffs, or even trade. It's about whether a nation, once underestimated, can take its place on the world stage and stay there. And that story is still being written.